Hello and welcome to this episode of Happy Baking. This episode is all about buttercream, baby. There are so many varieties of buttercream and they all make creamy, delicious frostings. But they utilize different techniques and can result in an array of different textures and consistencies. In this episode, I'm going to dive into each type of buttercream and the ingredients and techniques used to make them. And I'll show you what they look like when they're spread and when they're piped. My hope is that this episode is going to guide you in choosing the right frosting for your next baking project. And of course, I'm going to teach you lots of frosting basics along the way. It's going to be an immensely smooth and buttery episode. So let's get baking. You know I always have real butter on hand for my baking projects, which is why I'm so excited that this episode is brought to you by my friends at Go Bold with Butter. Woo! We've partnered up to encourage you to use real butter in your baking. Real butter provides incredible richness and flavor to all your bakes. But it's more than just flavor. Butter can do it all. Butter can be mixed into all kinds of cakes and cookies. It can be melted to form a flavorful base for just about any recipe, and it can even be whipped to become gorgeously light and airy. In this episode, I'll be manipulating butter in a variety of ways to make tasty frostings galore. So be sure to stock up on real butter before you make any of the recipes in this episode. Because as my friends at Go Bold with Butter like to say, everything is better with butter. First, let's talk about butter. Since it's all about the butter here, it is in the name after all. Let's talk about the most important ingredient in buttercream. I want to talk about salted versus unsalted butter. Salt is a fairly essential ingredient in baking, and I'm typically team unsalted butter, just adding salt to my recipes as needed to get that flavor in there. I'm not immune to loving salted butter though, and I typically just add less salt to my bakes when I want to use it. Buttercream is actually one time I really enjoy using salted butter. And unlike doughs or batters that contain raw ingredients, you can always taste your buttercream to make sure the salt level is just right. If you want to use salted butter in any of the buttercream recipes in this episode, just cut out the salt. You can always add more to taste if needed. How does fat impact consistency? This and more at 9. Remember that some butters you can buy in grocery stores contain a higher fat content. This makes them naturally softer than others. Higher fat butters are typically a little bit easier to incorporate smoothly into buttercreams. And they're delicious. However, because of that higher fat content, they're also more prone to warming up while you're working with them, say from the heat of your hand while you're piping. Butters with a lower fat content may be more difficult to incorporate smoothly. However, on the other hand, they may be more stable and less prone to extreme temperature changes. Recipes for buttercream will usually reference a specific temperature for the butter. In many cases for classic buttercreams, recipes will call for room temperature butter. People ask me all the time, what exactly is room temperature? And the most important thing is, remember, it's easier to incorporate a softer butter into a buttercream. Room temperature means sort of a neutral temperature. The butter shouldn't be so warm that it's melty or visibly greasy, but it also shouldn't be so cold that it breaks into clumps when you're mixing it. It should mix and incorporate smoothly. Soft butter is also easy to whip to incorporate air, which is one of the primary goals in achieving a light and fluffy buttercream. For me, the ideal temperature when a recipe calls for room temperature butter is around 65 degrees Fahrenheit or 18 degrees Celsius. But what happens when the butter is too cold? If the butter is too cold, it often doesn't distribute evenly, meaning you may end up with small pellets of butter distributed throughout the mixture. If the base mixture of the buttercream is warm and you add cold butter to it, it's going to lower the temperature of that base. This can lead to a deflated or less aerated buttercream. But there is even one method that uses this technique intentionally to create a denser, glossier buttercream. More on that later. But what happens if the butter is too warm? If the butter is too warm, it can cause separation. The fat can actually separate from the base mixture and cause the mixture to become really greasy. If the base mixture of your buttercream is warm and you add warm butter to it, it can melt the butter, which can prevent it from whipping up and becoming light and aerated. All of this talk about understanding temperature is just meant to help you in the process, but I don't want it to be intimidating, because even when buttercream recipes go awry, it's actually super easy to save it. In fact, it's common for some buttercream recipes to separate no matter how carefully you mix, and if you keep whipping the buttercream, it will come back together in the end. Separated buttercream may look almost curdled rather than smooth. It may look sort of greasy if the fat has become separated, or it may look kind of grainy. To salvage a separated buttercream, whip it on medium-high speed until it comes back together. Don't be worried about how long it takes, just be patient. If you still see little flecks of butter in your buttercream after mixing, you may need to apply a small amount of heat just to help that final bit of butter incorporate more fully. This can be done with my favorite friend, the kitchen torch, or by placing your mixer bowl over a double boiler just for a brief period of time to warm it up. If your buttercream mixture is liquid or very, very soft after significant whipping, it may actually need help in the other direction, chilling it a little bit in the refrigerator or over an ice bath to help it firm back up. But remember, since the act of whipping incorporates air and helps to cool things down, usually significant whipping is enough to get your buttercream to come back together. It's easy to tint just about any buttercream with food coloring to create decorative effects. There are several types of food coloring. The most common that you see in grocery stores and craft stores are liquid food coloring and gel food coloring. I prefer gel food coloring over liquid. Not only is gel coloring more intense, adding too much liquid to a buttercream can also cause separation. You may have experienced this yourself if you're ever trying to achieve a really intense color like red. You're adding red food coloring to something and it's just staying pink. So you keep adding, and all of a sudden the mixture is ruined and split. The ratio has been altered. To tint your buttercream, add your food coloring at the end of mixing. Remember that buttercreams that are naturally lighter or whiter in color are going to tint a more true color than one that has more of a yellowish or ivory hue. There is actually so much to know about food coloring, and now I'm wondering if I should do a whole episode on it. So if you'd like to see an episode on food coloring, let me know in the comments. The key to smoother buttercreams. A pastry chef and baker that I once work with and I really admire, Caitlin Freeman, once told me this incredible piece of buttercream advice. She said a good buttercream should have a consistency similar to mayonnaise. Some buttercreams, like French or German buttercreams, naturally are closer to this consistency after mixing. This is due to their higher level of enrichments and fat content. Others, like meringue-based buttercreams, may need to be warmed slightly to achieve this texture. Using a kitchen torch on the side of a mixer bowl is my favorite way to achieve this consistency, just applying a little bit of heat to warm it up while it's mixing. Warming the mixture while it's mixing also helps to knock out major air pockets. This is going to help you get a smoother frosting when you go to apply it to your cake. Another way to knock out large air pockets is to switch to the paddle attachment and mix your buttercream on low speed. You do this at the end of mixing just to help remove any larger air bubbles. But just FYI, this is an extra step. It's not required for any type of buttercream. And I have my own not so secret trick that I use to make buttercreams a little bit smoother. Sometimes I like to add a little bit of freshly melted chocolate at the end of mixing my buttercream. I actually did this in the vanilla layer cake episode, so you can check it out there too. The chocolate disperses through the mixture, warming it up slightly and giving a smoother texture overall. If I want chocolate flavor, I'll use darker milk chocolate, but if I don't really want any chocolate flavor, I'll just use white chocolate, which will add an additional richness, creaminess, and vanilla-y taste to the buttercream. I do this most often with Swiss or Italian meringue buttercreams because they have a tendency to be the most fluffy. You can add up to 170 grams or 6 ounces of melted chocolate to any of the buttercreams in this episode if you want to give this a try. Buttercream can be easily flavored with things like extracts, flavorful liqueurs, spices, or citrus zest. More advanced flavoring techniques might include infusing the buttercream with flavors like coffee, tea, or fresh herbs. There are lots of different types of buttercream, and it can be difficult to know which one is right for your baking project. I've broken down all the different types in this episode. We're gonna make them together one by one. Let's get started. First, let's talk about the absolute easiest one to make, American buttercream. And it produces a thick, dense frosting that is also the sweetest one on the buttercream list. To make American buttercream, cream, butter, and powdered sugar until light and fluffy. This usually takes about 5 to 7 minutes. To avoid a powdered sugar shower when you turn on the mixer and powdered sugar just goes everywhere, you can use a clean kitchen towel draped over your mixer. This sort of helps to contain any sugar that might puff up while you're mixing. I like to add a small amount of room temperature cream at the end of making my American buttercream. It makes it a little bit softer and more spreadable. After the mixture is smooth, you can add fine sea salt and any flavorings like vanilla. I like American buttercream best as a thin layer on top of sheet cakes or cupcakes. It also makes a great icing for cookies or as a filling for sandwich cookies. It is possible to pipe American buttercream, but the powdered sugar makes it firmer in texture, so it can have sort of more of a jagged look and not look as smooth when piped. Let's talk about Russian buttercream. I've always known this as sweetened condensed milk buttercream, but people refer to it both ways. This frosting is as easy to make as American buttercream, maybe even easier. In my opinion, it has a much better overall balance of both flavor and texture. American buttercream is cloyingly sweet and sometimes quite thick due to that powdered sugar. But Russian buttercream is immensely creamy and smooth, and in my opinion, just sweet enough. To make it, first, we have to whip the butter on high speed until it is extremely light and fluffy. Incorporating a lot of air lightens the butter, and this makes it possible to add the sweetened condensed milk in without the buttercream breaking. Getting the butter light enough is essential to this frosting, so don't be afraid to really whip it. The butter will start out yellow, but it's gonna end up almost white in color. This will take about 8 minutes on high speed. Then, with the mixer running on medium speed, add the sweetened condensed milk gradually, in about 4 additions. After all the sweetened condensed milk is incorporated, keep whipping the frosting until it is completely smooth, 1 to 4 minutes more. Then you can add fine sea salt and any flavorings like vanilla extract. This is a great multi-purpose buttercream that works great as a filling or a frosting. It works for both smooth or swoopy frosting techniques and works well for piping. Let's talk about Ermine Buttercream. Ermine? Yours? Ours? This is a frosting that goes by many other names sometimes, especially in vintage cookbooks. Sometimes it's called boiled milk frosting, sometimes it's called flour buttercream, and sometimes it's even called pudding buttercream. It's made with sort of a dairy custard base that's thickened with flour. It creates a super fluffy, light frosting that's very nostalgic for me. It's easy, not too sweet, and super creamy. If you've never tried this frosting, I think you'll really like it. To make it, whisk the sugar, flour, and salt together in a pot. Then whisk in the milk until the mixture is smooth. Cook this mixture, whisking constantly until it becomes thick and pudding-like, about 3 to 4 minutes. That custardy, puddingy base has to be cooled completely before we can mix it into the buttercream. To speed this up, sometimes I pour it onto a baking sheet because that increased surface area will help it cool down a lot faster. Whip the butter on high speed in an electric mixer fitted with the whip attachment until light and fluffy, 4 to 5 minutes. Gradually add the cooled custard base in 4 to 5 additions, whipping well after each to combine fully. After all the custard is incorporated, continue whipping until it is smooth and creamy, 2 to 4 minutes more. This is a great multi-purpose buttercream that I typically find is a huge crowd pleaser. I typically use it more for home-style cakes, like snack cakes, cupcakes, or sheet cakes. Let's talk about Swiss buttercream. Swiss buttercream uses Swiss meringue as the base. It's light, fluffy, and incredibly versatile. To make it, we'll whisk together the egg whites and sugar in a heat-safe bowl and place it over a pot of barely simmering water. Heat the mixture, whisking constantly until it reaches 160 degrees Fahrenheit or 71 degrees Celsius. This heats the eggs to a safe-to-eat temperature. Once the mixture is warm enough, transfer the bowl to an electric stand mixer fitted with the whip attachment. Whip the egg whites on high speed until the mixture reaches stiff peaks. Then continue to whip until the mixer bowl no longer feels warm to the touch. This will help to cool the meringue, bringing it more to room temperature before we add the butter in. Finally, we'll start to add the butter 14 grams or 1 tablespoon at a time. Continue to whip the mixture after each piece of butter is incorporated to make sure it's fully mixed in. This will help to maintain the lightness of the meringue while we incorporate the butter. Add the fine sea salt and any flavorings you're adding, such as vanilla, and then continue to whip until light and smooth. Swiss buttercream is good for most tasks, but it's especially great for filling and frosting layer cakes. Because meringue buttercreams are some of the whitest that you can make, they're also great for tinting with different colors. Let's talk about Italian buttercream. This is another type of meringue buttercream made using Italian meringue as the base. Bakers tend to have preferences, and personally I do tend to lean more to Italian buttercream than Swiss buttercream in my own bakes. Personally, I find it a bit more stable and easy to work with. Here's how you make it. Start by placing the egg whites and cream of tartar in the bowl of an electric mixer fitted with the whip attachment. Cook the sugar and water in a medium pot over medium heat. At first, I'm gonna stir this mixture to help dissolve the sugar, but as soon as it starts to simmer, I'm gonna stop stirring. If any of the sugar mixture washes up on the sides of the pot while you're stirring, it's important to wash it away. I like to use a pastry brush dipped in cool water. This way we don't get any sugar crystallizing on the side of the pot. Continue to cook the sugar syrup until it reaches 240 degrees Fahrenheit or 115 degrees Celsius on a digital thermometer. Just before the sugar reaches the right temperature, when it's about 230 degrees Fahrenheit or 110 degrees Celsius, turn the egg whites on to start whipping on medium-high speed. The goal is that we'll get the egg whites to soft peaks by the time the sugar syrup is at the right temperature. When the sugar is hot enough, gradually pour it into the mixer while it's running in a slow, steady stream. Once all the sugar syrup is incorporated, continue to whip the meringue until it reaches stiff peaks and the bowl is no longer warm to the touch. This extended whipping helps to cool down the meringue so that the butter's not gonna melt when we start adding it in. Finally, it's time to add the butter. We'll add it about 14 grams or 1 tablespoon at a time. Continue to whip the buttercream after each addition to make sure each is fully incorporated. This helps to maintain the lightness of the buttercream. We don't wanna add all that butter at once, which will sort of start to cause the meringue to collapse. We wanna add it a little bit at a time to maintain as much lightness and fluffiness as possible. Finally, add fine sea salt and any other flavorings to the buttercream at the very end. Keep mixing until it's light and smooth. There are a lot of great ways to use this buttercream. Of the classic versions, it's really the one that I turn to the most. It's great for filling and frosting layer cakes, and it's wonderful for piping. Let's talk about Korean buttercream. This style of buttercream is also referred to as glossy buttercream. This method was created by Korean baker and baking instructor Joo Gong of GG Cakecraft. This method is sort of a variant of classic Italian buttercream. This style also uses Italian meringue as the base, so the initial part of making it is exactly the same. We'll cook the sugar syrup and prepare the meringue as directed. The primary difference with this method is that the meringue is cooled down after whipping, and cold butter is added to it during the final whipping stages. This creates a glossier buttercream that is slower to melt when you're piping or working with it. After whipping the meringue, it needs to be cooled down to about 85 degrees Fahrenheit or 30 degrees Celsius. This can be done by whipping it longer, or to speed it up, you can pop it in the freezer for 5 to 10 minutes. Before adding the butter to the meringue, make sure it's the right temperature. It should be around 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees Celsius. Once the meringue is cool enough, add the butter a little bit at a time, just as we did for Italian buttercream. Don't freak out. This buttercream will look curdled and broken at first, but if you keep whipping it, it will become glossy and smooth. Keep whipping it until the mixture starts to come together around the whip attachment. It should look smooth and thick, but not as fluffy as other meringue-style buttercream. This style of buttercream was specifically developed with detailed piping techniques like buttercream flowers in mind. It works especially well for intricate piping work, especially because of its stability and consistency. Let's talk about French buttercream. French buttercream uses similar techniques to Italian buttercream, but with a few different base ingredients. This isn't a meringue-based buttercream. Instead, the base is whole eggs and egg yolks. When combined with sugar, this mixture is known as a pâte bombe. The added enrichments in this buttercream make this a frosting worth gushing about. It's rich and unbelievably creamy and oh so smooth. Because of the whole eggs and egg yolks, this buttercream also boasts a soft golden hue. To make French buttercream, start by placing the whole eggs and egg yolks in the bowl of an electric mixer fitted with the whip attachment. Next, cook the sugar and water in a small pot over medium heat. At first, stir the mixture to help dissolve the sugar, but only until it comes to a simmer. While you're stirring, if any sugar washes up on the sides of the pot, use a pastry brush dipped in cool water to brush it away. Continue to cook until the mixture reads 240 degrees Fahrenheit or 115 degrees Celsius on a digital thermometer. A little before the sugar comes to the proper temperature, when it's at about 230 degrees Fahrenheit or 110 degrees Celsius, start whipping the egg mixture on medium-high speed. The goal is to get our egg foam to ribbon stage, which means it should be very pale and thick by the time our sugar syrup comes to the proper temperature. Gradually add the hot sugar syrup to the egg mixture in a slow, steady stream. Once all the sugar syrup is incorporated, continue to whip on high speed until the mixture is very pale, thick, and the bowl is no longer warm to the touch. Finally, we'll start to add the butter gradually, about 14 grams or 1 tablespoon at a time. Continue to whip after each addition to incorporate the butter gradually. This helps to maintain the lightness of the egg mixture while we incorporate the fat. Then continue to whip until the mixture is light and smooth. At the very end of mixing the buttercream, add the vanilla and the fine sea salt. There are a lot of great uses for French buttercream. I personally love using it for filling and frosting cakes. It's less effective for decorative techniques like piping just because this buttercream is so soft, so it may hold the shape, just not as crisp as you'd like. German buttercream is made using a classic custard known as pastry cream as the base. It's a bit richer and can be slightly softer than other buttercreams as a result. Adding a little bit of powdered sugar to the buttercream helps with the overall consistency. I personally love the creaminess and custardiness of this buttercream. It's so good. Start by putting the milk and the cream into the pot. I'm gonna heat this to a simmer. And while it's simmering, I'm just gonna whisk my sugar and cornstarch in a heat-safe bowl to combine. I'll also add the salt in with that sugar and cornstarch. Just whisk it well to combine. Okay, my mixture is just starting to simmer. I'm gonna turn the heat down a little bit and whisk my egg yolks into that sugar and cornstarch mixture. Just wanna whisk that till it's nice and smooth. Now that this is all mixed together, it's time to temper our egg yolk mixture with the warm milk and cream. I'm gonna add about 1/3 of it into that mixture while whisking constantly. This helps to bring the mixture to a warmer temperature. Before we add it into the pot, it reduces the risk of scrambling the eggs. Now I'll just add this back into the pot, whisking constantly. I'm gonna continue to cook this over medium-low heat until it's thick enough to coat the back of the spoon and we see some large bubbles popping up at the top. I'll start with the whisk just to keep things in motion, but eventually as it starts to thicken, I'm gonna switch to my silicone spatula because it's going to make an easier job of making sure that nothing is getting too cooked on the sides or corners of the pot. It's really starting to get nice and thick. So I've switched to my spatula and I just want to see at least one large bubble come up and then I'll know that it's thick enough. The last ingredient I'm gonna add is just a little bit of butter to start cooling this down. This mixture will need to cool before we can turn it into buttercream. So I'm just gonna pour it onto a baking sheet because that expanded surface area is gonna help it cool down a lot faster. If you want, this is also something you could do ahead of time, making the pastry cream in advance and then making your buttercream when you're ready to use it. Cover the surface of the pastry cream directly with plastic wrap to prevent it from forming a skin while it cools. Once the pastry cream is cool, it's time to whip the buttercream. Whip the butter in the bowl of an electric stand mixer on high speed until light and fluffy, 4 to 5 minutes. Gradually add the cooled pastry cream in 4 to 5 additions, whipping well to combine each addition before adding the next. After it's all incorporated, continue whipping until the mixture is fluffy and smooth, about 2 to 4 minutes more. Add the powdered sugar and any flavoring you're using and mix to combine. There's a lot of ways to use German buttercream, but I typically use it more as a filling rather than a frosting. It's great inside cakes, sandwich cookies, and even donuts. It is possible to pipe this frosting, but just don't expect it to hold its shape quite as well as some other varieties. Let's talk about storing and reconstituting buttercream. One of the great things about buttercream is it can be made ahead of time, or leftover buttercream can be saved for future projects. After storing, buttercream needs to be reconstituted to bring it back to a light and fluffy texture. Buttercream can be stored in the refrigerator in an airtight container for up to 1 week. Bring the buttercream to room temperature before reconstituting. Buttercream can be stored in the freezer for up to 3 months. Thaw the buttercream in the refrigerator overnight and then bring to room temperature, or thaw the mixture at room temperature for a few hours before reconstituting. To reconstitute the buttercream, put it into the bowl of an electric mixer fitted with the whip attachment, and then begin to whip it on medium speed. Sometimes it can be helpful to add a little bit of heat with the help of the kitchen torch or by placing the bowl of the mixer over a double boiler briefly to help warm it up. Continue to whip the buttercream until it is back to its original texture, light and fluffy. Boom! You just reconstituted. Yay! Thank you so much for joining me for this buttery, creamy buttercream episode of Happy Baking. As always, all the recipes I made in this episode are linked in the video description below for all your frosting needs. If this episode inspires you to get baking, please let me know in the comments or use #HappyBaking. I love to see what you're making in your kitchens. If you want even more baking fun, be sure to subscribe to my newsletter. You can subscribe by heading to my website, ErinJeanneMcDowell.com. And until next time, wishing you lots of happy, buttery baking. Russian buttercream, Swiss buttercream, Ermine buttercream, German buttercream, Italian buttercream, American buttercream, Korean buttercream, and France!